Welcome back to Junior English, and we now turn to a correlative reading with that kind of is set in your textbook next to or alongside of the work of Mark Twain, the great American humorist and satirist. I'm with you on page 588, 589, the Bill Bryson text. We're going to read a brief story from his larger autobiography, The Life and Times of the Thunderbolt Kid, a memoir. Let's jot down at 2B really quickly. What is a memoir? A memoir is an autobiography. It's just another word for autobiography. It's an attempt to try to write down the great memories of a person's life written by the person himself, herself. Now, in this story, just to kind of get you set here, we're going to involve ourselves with hyperbole. Now, I know you already wrote that word down when you were studying your Twain information. If you go back, for example, and you look on page 569, on 569, do you see where it says hyperbole? Okay, if something is hyperbolic or hyperbole is involved, it is an exaggeration or to embellish things. So for example, if somebody starts talking about the fish they caught, and all of a sudden that fish is not this, but it's this bit, you know, that kind of thing, that's it. That's what we mean by hyperbole. In other words, you exaggerate or you overstate something. So I'm going to ask you as we read this text, I'm going to ask you to find examples of hyperbole. Now the story actually begins on 589, the only downside of my mother's working, and then we'll continue on to 590, okay? So here we go. Let's follow along and enjoy this reading, shall we?
From The Life and Times of the Thunderbolt Kid by Bill Bryson. The only downside of my mother's working was that it put a little pressure on her with regard to running the home, and particularly with regard to dinner, which frankly was not her strong suit anyway. My mother always ran late and was dangerously forgetful into the bargain. You soon learned to stand aside about 10 to 6 every evening, for it was then that she would fly in the back door, throw something in the oven, and disappear into some other quarter of the house to embark on
page 590
household tasks that greeted her each evening. In consequence, she nearly always forgot about dinner until a point slightly beyond way too late. As a rule, you knew it was time to eat when you could hear potatoes exploding in the oven. We didn't call it the kitchen in our house. We called it the Burns unit. It's a bit burnt.
Okay, so we start out by him saying, when I was a kid, my mom had to work. She came in late. She would come flying into the house to make a meal. And notice the hyperbole or the exaggeration on 590. We always, as a rule, knew it was time to eat when you could hear potatoes exploding in the oven. And then notice the humor. We call the kitchen the Burns unit, like you would in a hospital, simply because she wasn't the best of cooks, if you will. All right, so here we go, a bit of humor.
Burned, my mother would say apologetically at every meal, presenting you with a piece of meat that looked like something, a much-loved pet perhaps, salvaged from a tragic house fire. But I think I scraped off most of the burned part, she would add, overlooking that this included every bit of it that had once been flesh. Happily, all this suited my father. His palate only responded to 2 tastes, burned and ice cream, so everything suited him, so long as it was sufficiently dark and not too startlingly flavorful. Theirs truly was a marriage made in heaven, for no one could burn food like my mother or eat it like my dad. As part of her job, my mother bought stacks of housekeeping magazines. House Beautiful, House and Garden, Better Homes and Gardens, Good Housekeeping. And I read these with a certain avidity, partly because they were always lying around, and in our house all idle moments were spent reading something, and partly because they depicted lives so absorbingly at variance with our own. The housewives in my mother's magazines were so collected, so organized, so calmly on top of things, and their food was perfect. Their lives were perfect. They dressed up to take their food out of the oven. There were no black circles on the ceiling above their stoves, no mutating goo climbing over the sides of their forgotten saucepans. Children didn't have to be ordered to stand back every time they opened their oven doors, and their foods, baked Alaska, lobster Newburgh, chicken cacciatore, why, these were dishes we didn't even dream of, much less encounter in Iowa. Like most people in Iowa in the 1950s, we were more cautious eaters in our house. On the rare occasions when we were presented with food with which we were not comfortable or familiar, on planes or trains, or when invited to a meal cooked by someone who was not herself from Iowa, we tended to tilt it up carefully with a knife and examine it from every angle as if determining whether it might need to be diffused.
Top of page 591.
Once on a trip to San Francisco, my father was taken by friends to a Chinese restaurant, and he described it to us afterward in the somber tones of someone recounting a near-death experience. "And they eat it with sticks, you know," he added knowledgeably. "Goodness," said my mother.
"I would rather have gas gangrene than go through that again,"
my father added grimly. In our house, we didn't eat pasta, rice, cream cheese, sour cream, garlic, mayonnaise, onions, corned beef, pastrami, salami, or foreign food of any type except French toast, bread that wasn't white and at least 65% air, spices other than salt, pepper, and maple syrup, fish that was any shape other than rectangular and not coated in bright orange breadcrumbs, and then only on Fridays and only when my mother remembered it was Friday, which in fact was not often, soups not blessed by Campbell's, and only a very few of those, anything with dubious regional names like pone or gumbo, or foods that had at any time been an esteemed staple of slaves or peasants. All other foods of all types, curries, enchiladas, tofu, bagels, sushi, couscous, yogurt, kale, arugula, parma ham, any cheese that was not a vivid, bright yellow and shiny enough to see your reflection in, had either not yet been invented or was yet unknown to us. We really were radiantly unsophisticated. I remember being surprised to learn at quite an advanced age that a shrimp cocktail was not, as I had always imagined, a pre-dinner alcoholic drink with a shrimp in it. All our meals consisted of leftovers. My mother had a seemingly inexhaustible supply of foods that had already been to the table, sometimes repeatedly. Apart from a few perishable dairy products, everything in the fridge was older than I was, sometimes by many years. Her oldest food possession of all, it more or less goes without saying, was a fruitcake that was kept in a metal tin and dated from the colonial period. I can only assume that my mother did all of her cooking in the 1940s so that she could spend the rest of her life surprising herself with what she could find under cover at the back of the fridge. I never knew her to reject a food. The rule of thumb seemed to be that if you opened the lid and the stuff inside didn't make you actually recoil and take at least one staggered step backward, it was deemed okay to eat.
592.
Both of my parents had grown up during the Great Depression, and neither of them ever threw anything away if they could possibly avoid it. My mother routinely washed and dried paper plates and smoothed out for reuse spare aluminum foil. If you left a pea on your plate, it became part of a future meal. All our sugar came in little packets, spirited out of restaurants in deep coat pockets, as did our jams, jellies, crackers, oyster and saltine, tartar sauces, some of our ketchup and butter, all of our napkins, and a very occasional ashtray. Anything that came with a restaurant table, really. One of the happiest moments in my parents' life was when maple syrup started to be served in small disposable packets, and they could add those to the household hoard.
Okay, so let's now just talk for a few moments at level 1. If you had to say out loud, write it at level 1, what this passage is about, How would you qualify it? I mean, it's kind of, can you do it in one line? This is a person remembering his childhood, and more particularly the issue of cuisine, food, right? And the ways in which food kind of defined his family. So let's go ahead and think for a few moments at 2A about some of the observations that seem to be made here. Notice, for example, on page 591, radiantly unsophisticated is the way he qualifies his family. Now, to be sophisticated means that you kind of think of yourself as a little bit better than most everybody else. So unsophisticated means they have absolutely no problem with just being really normal people. To be radiantly unsophisticated would make you even more that way, right? So this begs a really interesting question. Let's list a couple of potential messages or themes here from a reading like this. 1, is it true that you are what you eat as a family? As a family. Forget about personal health, but as a family. So for example, what you've been raised eating within your family, within your own family culture, does that kind of define who you are? I've had students that read this passage that say, I've never really thought about this, but I guess when you analyze my own family and what we've eaten my whole life as we grew up, it is kind of all the same thing. For example, notice all the stuff in this list that they didn't eat. You only ate white bread, you didn't eat wheat bread, you know, this kind of thing. No pastas, this kind of thing. You know, in other words, does your family culture center in some ways around what you eat or do not eat? 3B question. What could you bring home tonight to serve your family that they would all collectively look at you and go, dude, what is wrong with you? We don't eat that. Can you write down one thing that you could bring home tonight? Have somebody else make it or whatever. Is there one dish tonight you could bring home to your family and say, hey, tonight we're going to try something new. This is what we're going to eat. And the people sitting around the table would go, yeah, no, get that filth out of here. We don't eat that wretchedness. What would it be for you? And see, some of you will go, I've never thought about this, but that says something about my family. And it says something about who I am. Notice it's not just we don't eat that stuff, but yeah, get it out, right? The dad will say, we don't do that kind of stuff. Get it out. It's not us. It's not our family, right? Message number 2. How about the idea that you change your tastes as you get older? When you grow up, you kind of think that this is what everybody does. And then you go spend the night at a friend's house, for example. And the next morning they make breakfast, only it's made different from the way you were raised. And you go, yeah, that's not how we do it in our house. At what age do you remember, 3B question, at what age do you remember kind of coming to terms with the fact that other families don't necessarily do things the way your family does? Do you remember that? And did any of it have to do with food? Of course, let's jump to 2B really quickly. This is a passage that obviously engages in all kinds of hyperbole. Notice he says about his mother that she made all of the food that they ever ate back during the colonial period, and then it just sits there in the back of the refrigerator waiting to be eaten again. Leftovers. Everything was leftovers, right? Okay. The humor is obviously a part of this passage, the hyperbole, the exaggeration, we would say. All right, let's go to 3A really quickly and how we relate to this. What is your favorite movie or TV show where food is involved? Where eating certain kinds of food is involved in the film. There's a scene maybe about eating food that is kind of funny. What is your favorite movie or TV show about families and a family that kind of is a little bit different? Maybe it's a way to kind of make fun of, family life. Finally, let's think a little bit about you and your own family and the way you were raised at 3B. This passage raises a lot of questions about who you are. Let's ask this question to start with. Are you part of a family that defines itself by food? Has your family defined itself by food? What you eat, what you don't eat. Second question, are you a finicky eater? So for example, if people give you something to eat, are you inclined to just eat it? Or do you first have to ask what it is? What is that? Are you inclined to say, if I've never tasted it, then I don't eat it? Or are you more experimental in your cuisine choices? A simple question. When you go out to eat somewhere, even if it's in our small town, do you order the same thing every time? I had a student once that said, dude, I have this friend, she drives me nuts. We'll walk into Big Mac, I get what I always get, and she stands there looking at the menu. And I'm always the same. Dude, you know the menu. It's not the, no, I've got to decide what I want today. What have I not tried? And you're like, dude, we don't have to try everything on the stinking menu. Get what you like. No, I want to try something new. Do you have a pal like this? You go to a restaurant, he or she has to read every single thing on the menu to decide what it is we're going to eat. What kind of eater are you? Are you a very predictable eater, like they would say if somebody wanted to poison you, they would know how to do it pretty easy in the restaurant, because when you come in, you get the same thing every single time. You do not deviate at all. Which begs a really interesting question. If you're a person who knows what you like to eat, and that's all you eat, when did that start for you? Can you remember when you started identifying your favorite food? So for example, maybe your mom or somebody said, hey, for your birthday, we're going to make you your favorite meal. Jot down really quickly at 3B. What is your favorite meal? This has always been, of course, one of those fun questions to ask. What is the meal that for you think is the very best meal possible? Of course, another darker way to think about it is, if you only had one meal left and you had to eat it tonight, and somebody had to make you that meal, and it had to be made really well, what would you choose to have? Right? Some of you would say, no. It's not enough that it would be a pizza. It's got to be a pizza from a very particular place and or person who makes it. Right? There are people, for example, who don't eat hot dogs. They eat the ballpark hot dogs at, for example, a certain ballpark. Right? So for example, Coors Field makes a certain kind of hot dog. That's the only one that I would want to eat. That kind of thing. Do you have preferences for food now at your age? Another question for 3B. Do you think there is a food you've never eaten you would like to try? Can you write down a food? Some of them are listed here. For example, if you've never tried sushi, which is usually uncooked fish, do you think that's something you would be willing to try? Is there a certain kind of food you will never, ever again in your life eat? What is your list? Notice the list here is in bullet point on 591. What is your list for you personally? Can you write down 3 things you will not eat ever again? You tried it and you hated it, right? You tried it and you hated it. What is it for you? What are those foods for you? Are you a snacker? So do you have your favorite snack? So for example, what's your favorite candy bar? What's your favorite cookie? That kind of thing. Do you have one of those that you like as well? Isn't it interesting how often we find out what our favorite food is when we're sick? Oh, if I only felt better, I'd really like, or as you're starting to feel better, maybe your mom will say, honey, what do you want from the store? I'll get you anything. What is it that you often will ask for when you're feeling kind of crummy? Is there a certain kind of cuisine? What are your thoughts about international cuisine? Are there parts of the world that you think makes better food than others? I once had a student that said the best food is made in the world in Mexico. That is the best food in the world. I'm sorry. I feel sorry for you people that have to live in a place where you don't get to eat real food. But I can just tell you now that the best food in the world is in Mexico. You should go and visit sometime. Do you want to travel so that you can taste food? So you can taste cuisine? Notice the joke here, the only foreign food we ate was French toast, which is of course kind of a joke, right? Okay. There is French cuisine, and it is of course known to be very good, but you have to eat it often in France, or of course in restaurants that serve French cuisine. So it's very interesting maybe to ask, do you have a list of places you'd like to travel and try their food? Is there a place you'd like to travel to and then try the cuisine? Are you a finicky eater? Do you go, for example, to a foreign land and then seek out the burger place that is just like the burger place where you come from? Well, there you go. An introduction, a kind of funny little reading. Thank you.